So our next speaker will be Patricia Balvanera, and Patty has been engaged for several years in Working Group 6 of GEO. By the way, I forgot to mention also that Matt, over the last couple of years, has also been the co-chair of Working Group 3 in GEO. But Patty has been involved with GEO for much longer time, and she comes from the National University of Mexico. I know Patty for almost 20 years. I was in Stanford when she was a postdoc at Stanford University. And I have to say a few words about the work that has been done in the Ecosystem Service Working Group in GEO, because I think it has been some of the most cutting edge and novel work that GEO has done as a whole. And Patty has really had a leadership role in that. It's really exciting to have her present some of his work, of this work today. And a big thank you, Patty, for all the leadership on Working Group 6. Thank you very much.
There you go. Okay, so thank you so much, Henrik, for the invitation. I'm so glad to be here and to be able to share some ideas with all of you on ecosystem services. So, in fact, I was actually going to refer to the time when I arrived to Stanford and I met Henrik. And by then, basically, the literature on ecosystem services was largely the book by Daly et al. On edge services and the Constanza et al. Paper. And during the postdoc, we worked with Enrique and others on trying to think on conserving biodiversity and ecosystem services. So basically, the information was quite scarce, and also the ideas about what kinds of impacts into policies were also kind of reduced. Since then, we have seen an amazing growth in the ecosystem services literature of Millennium Assessment, both the conceptual tools, but also a lot of guidance on how to do this. Then we saw the TIF, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, with all the conceptual framework and a lot of applications. We have seen now many countries doing national assessments of ecosystem services. And there's a growing amount of tools to map or to assess at different spatial scales with different types of models ecosystem services. Also, there's a growing amount of data on how to monitor some variables of ecosystems that some can be related to ecosystem services. We also have a growing amount of literature on which tools are better in which conditions and what are the approaches that can be used. And we also have nice websites with guidance on which tools can be used into different contexts. So if we could take a quick look at this literature, and then we also have this new platform, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, that is really putting ecosystem services at the front. And it's about understanding what are the trends and conditions and future conditions of both biodiversity and ecosystem services to generate new methodologies to strengthen capacities, communicate, and do these regional and global and thematic assessments. But if we, with all these backgrounds, if we got the question of how to monitor ecosystem services to support policy design at national scales, at regional and global scales, for instance, in the case of the IPBES, or even at subnational and local scales, if we saw this literature, we would say, well, piece of cake, right? where you just hit the roadman, you have all the instructions, there you go. I would say this is really not true. It is way more complex, and we really have a lot of missing holes, and we really need to think hard still about how to do this. It's way less standardized of how to do this. So what I want to share with you are some key questions we want to ask ourselves before embarking in this monitoring. Some key challenges that we still need to face and we need to address in the following years. And also would like to tell you some of the role of GEOBON, of the Working Group 6 on ecosystem services in past and future and current and vision to the future of how to contribute to this. So about the questions. One important question is, what decision is at stake? In a very different way to what we heard a while ago, we saw these fantastic databases and products which actually are aimed to very specific questions. But this is even more important in the case of ecosystem services, because depending on the particular decision, the particular set of stakeholders, the particular context, we need to do the assessment of ecosystem services in very different ways. So as Gretchen Daly and the NatCap project put it, really decisions is really the very first steps to understand what ecosystem services and so on are at stake. So I would argue that the kinds of assessments that we need to have in mind when thinking of, for instance, the CBD and the aim to mainstream biodiversity for well-being at national scales would be very different to what Vital Signs and Bob Scholes, who is here leading this, is trying to do in terms of trying to understand how agricultural activities are linked to ecosystems at the local level, and what is the local link between ecosystems and these agricultural systems and people. So we need to understand, of course, very well the context of this assessment we need to do, starting, of course, with the scale. And we tend to aim for regional to global scales within GEOBON, but we heard even a while ago how understanding what happens at the local scale is really important. But much more than that, we really need to understand these different scales and the interactions across these scales. Of course, the type of land cover and its characteristics, as we heard, is really important to determine the types of services that will be provided. But also biodiversity, the particular combination of species found in a site are also very important for the services, because biodiversity is really important as a regulator of the kinds of processes that underpin the services. And we have here some examples of how, for example, the kinds of soil microorganisms depend on, have particular effects on soil fertility regulation. Also, because biodiversity itself is a provisioning service, as we heard a while ago, in terms of a source of food. And also because biodiversity is also appreciated by itself and has also importance just on its own, and providing a lot of cultural services. So we really need to understand not only the biophysical condition, but these social ecological factors that will lead to social ecological production functions of the services, and to understand the drivers of change that are really affecting each of these production functions. One issue that has been growingly emerging in the ecosystem services literature is the awareness of the co-production of services by people. So, of course, we heard the human activity has impacts on ecosystems, but there's actually, in order to produce these services, there's not only impacts on the ecological processes, but there's a cognitive co-production. There's an active co-production depending on the human manufacture of social and financial capital that leads to decision-making in how to explicitly manipulate the ecosystem. It's very important to be mindful of who is involved. And just an example, we have here the wins and lose between different services where some stakeholders win and others lose. Maybe some have barriers to access and others not. Benefits can be very uneven, or they can be indirect benefits. But there's also all the issue about who makes these decisions and which decisions and which voices are being heard. Of course, the spatial context is very well developed, so I will not go too much into that. But we have all these maps of ecosystem services, but are not so much aware of this difference between the source region, the use region, where there can be access that exhausts the resource or not, different sink region, and the flow of services has not really been so well developed. When we think about what should we monitor, there are many dimensions of ecosystem services that have been identified. In this case, as a product of Working Group 6, we identified the difference between the functions, the supply, the service that is dependent on human location and activities, and the benefits that are dependent on the social preferences. And in a similar way, maybe in a much more detailed way, the TEEB, now leading to this European classification of services, really differentiate supporting or intermediate services, the structure, the function, then the final service, then the benefits and the value. And there's an amazing discussion about which services to monitor. This is, of course, you cannot read, but I just want to show you all the services that are recognized by this classification, European classification of services, and its comparison to the MA or to the TEEB. And there's really no easy solution between universal lists or unique lists depending on the region, and the IPBES is actually facing these kind of questions. Do we have to do something exhaustive or rather strategic towards a few services? Do we have to focus only on those we have information for, or do we really have to push harder for those we don't have information for? And just to share you one example of these issues is this work by Cáceres and et al. In the Chaco region in Argentina, where they show that for different types of stakeholders within different kinds of land uses, these are the services that are recognized and preferred by different stakeholders. So it really makes a huge difference which stakeholder you are taking into account to choose these lists of services. And the issue that was raised a while ago, who is going to monitor? Are we thinking about researchers? Today, a lot of the research in ecosystem services are researchers here and there, and there's zillions of researchers gathering to, for instance, ecosystem services partnerships. But do we need, there are some teams of large projects and some large networks. What is the role for governance? What will be they will be monitoring, and the role for practitioners? And this would lead us to the choice of indicators. And the choice of indicators, again, is not independent of this context. So we really need to understand the stakeholders, their objectives, in order to identify the questions and the types of indicators in order to identify the kind of data, parameterize, and refine, and then run it again through the stakeholders. About the data sources, there's a range of data sources all the way from remote sensing at the range of spatial scales, from global coverage to higher and higher resolution, fortunately, to high resolution and patchy coverage. National statistics are an interesting data stream for this low resolution, but global coverage. And there's all these site data that is being gathered. And so we can get information on the track of pollinators just based on global statistics and some playing with the data. This remote sensing has provided a lot of information on many ecosystem services like flood regulation or natural hazard regulation. And of course, this map shown a while ago on land cover is really one major input. The second is NDVI. But other services like cultural services, in this case, all these services related to recreation or walking and so on, can only be gathered at a very local scale and cannot be so easily obtained at this scale. So in this comparison we made for some of these data streams and the kinds of components or dimensions of ecosystem services, we can see that remote sensing is really good for the supply and some for the delivery, for instance, some of the production of crops, but in even the economic value. But then field estimations can really tackle the contributions to well-being, and the models, depending on the type of models, can tackle on different ones, and there are different spatial scales. So what are some of the challenges we really need to address? There has been relatively little discussion in the ecosystem services literature about the monitor strategy design. How much will it cost? What are the spatial design? We heard a lot about the frequency updates needed. Standards for data collection. There's been some initiative, for instance, by Bob Scholes and others on having a sampling frame for monitoring services, and different projects have different ones, but there's really no agreement. The long-term monitoring. For biodiversity, we know that the long-term, the International Long-Term Ecological Research Network has long-term data, but most of it, 70%, is about ecosystem, and only a small fraction is about services, and very little about its implications for human well-being. Validation is also quite scarce in the ecosystem services world. And just to show you an example, this is carbon stocks comparing a model using dynamic vegetation model and using these remote sensing applications. And you have, for the case of Mexico, quite a good correlation in all these blue dots where there's a spatial, quite a good match. But there are some areas, like in the Amazon, where the models, the remote images get saturated, while the models really predict a much larger amount of carbon with large areas with discrepancies. And so if we are asked today about the progress towards targets, for instance, the Aichi target 14, which is about providing essential services, including all these services for the needs of women and so on, we did a literature review, and basically we found these patterns, but the most important part is that there was very low confidence, because we really don't have sound data for this, and we really need more systematic data to support this. And this will be even more important in the face of tracking progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a need for standards then, a need for standards about how to measure different services, how to address different issues. And this is, for the case of the US, some of the variables for which there are standards, and some of which there really a lot of work to be needed in trying to develop these standards. We know we are behind on the resilience and sustainability of the services. Really, what is the gap between the supply and demand and the processes that underpin the long-term supply and really meeting this demand? In particular, if we think about the dynamics of the services, we really need to be able to monitor the faster and the slower variables, specifically these ones that really lead to this long-term change, in order to understand what is happening with the dynamics of ecosystem services. And in general, we need to think about all the social ecological system as a whole, because we are really not thinking only about the biophysical system, but the interaction of people and how to sustain and these interactions and allow for well-being to be sustained. But much more than that, we also have all these very different data streams. But we need to be able to have a sound integration of them. There has been a lot of progress in trying to map what's been called the bundles of ecosystem. Bundles of ecosystem services, which are these packages of services that co-occur and that are produced within particular social ecological conditions. And there's been, in the last 5 years, a huge amount of literature trying to map these different social ecological regions and the types of bundles of services that emerge. But really, we know the pattern, but we are very far from understanding the functional interactions, for example, between food, water, energy, and livelihoods, and the flows of water, energy, and food, and the factors that modulate this interaction. And for conceptual understandings, in particular for the case of ecosystem services, and the links between biodiversity and ecosystem services, recently, the ecoservices team led by Elena Bennett and others recently identified 3 challenges on how to deal with what was needed to document on these interactions between biodiversity and services. So we really need to know much more about what are the interactions between biodiversity, landscape, and the system, and these modifications. We need to understand much better who is using these services and benefiting, what are their values, their patterns, but much more than that, we really need to understand the institutions that govern and how can we transform this. Of course, some work has been done on telecoupling of these social ecological systems and services, but we really need to be able to have data to monitor these interactions. And the issue of power, equity, and justice has been raised as when we have trade-offs among ecosystem services, there's really trade-offs among actors that can lead to social ecological conflicts and can lead due to social and historical context. So dealing with these power interactions and dealing with equity issues is growingly important. And strengthening the science policy interface. We used to produce the data and hopefully wait for stakeholders to use it. But as we know today, we actually are aiming for setting the objectives and designing the approach together, co-developing the models, the scenarios, and co-designing responses and implementation. So within this perspective, what has the GeoBond Working Group 6 trying to do? When GeoBond was started, and this is Bob's paper in 2008, ecosystem services were kind of one product of this network. And there were actually a lot of questions raised at the first GeoBond conference about the role of ecosystem services on this. But we have gone quite way forward. Observations, of course, are very important. And as we can see here in this conceptual diagram, GeoBond will hopefully provide the observations needed for assessments, decisions, and implementation through also a very strong link to research. But much more than that, GeoBond is also trying to foster accessibility to tools and data. And so ecosystem services are also being drawn to this effort for developing bond in a box, where methods, models, software, and a set of ecosystem services variables, which I'll get to in a second, will be available in a website in a very horizontal and autonomous way for people to interact with this. We have been able to produce proofs of concept. In this case, this is data from FAO and models, where we were able to monitor different ecosystem services, and this is the work by Danny Karp and others, on how the production of different services changed through time. The same for other proofs of concepts at very local scales for areas such as South Africa that are much more data hungry. And to provide guidance. So the role for GeoBond is to understand which are these ecosystem service variables, the different dimensions. And we would argue that we need to understand the supply, the ecological supply of service, the anthropogenic contribution to this co-production, the demand from society, and the actual use. We need to assess which are the benefits and beneficiaries and how well their needs are met, the values, both the economic and the sociocultural, and the benefits obtained by society, and understand the institutions and governance that regulate all this. Also, we have worked towards informing IPBES based on the conceptual framework, and this driver pressure state impact and response framework towards identify some key indicators for the different dimensions or the different aspects of the IPBES framework and the different topics from Future Earth. And GeoBond has played an important role trying to identify these indicators. And much more than that, we're also trying to identify key indicators that will allow to link these different dimensions and not just relate to only one of them. GeoBond is a very interesting platform where strategic interconnections can also be facilitated. So we're working towards suggesting that GeoBond, together with other networks like the Ecosystem Services Partnerships or Future Earth programs such as Ecoservices or PECs, the subglobal assessments, the Natural Capital Project, come together to a global framework for ecosystem services that can inform, for instance, IPBES, and now the process starting in a few weeks for the global assessments to strengthen the science policy interface, to provide guidance, to feed with specific case studies where the richness and the processes can be understood, to provide proofs of concept, and to, for capacity building towards these goals. In synthesis, what I've tried to show is how much monitoring ecosystem services has gone a long way, but we still need to think very clearly about some considerations. There are important challenges that still need to be faced that we hope to be able to tackle quite soon, and GeoBond could play an important role in addressing some of these challenges. A lot of this work and these ideas has been developed by the Working Group 6 on ecosystem services. And I would like to thank some of the current and past members of the GeoBond Working Group for all their insights and fun work together.
Thanks. this really wonderful talk about the work of Working Group 6. We have time for 2 questions.
Ilse.
Thank you, Carlos. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Patty, for a very interesting and challenging presentation. I see we have our works cut out for us. I was wondering, sorry, my name is Ilse. I was wondering about the reflection you gave on IPBES in comparison to what's happening in Europe, where there seems to be more focus on natural capital accounting, versus a global tendency, hopefully more towards more inclusive ecosystem services and socio-ecological systems. Do you see any tendencies of that within IPBES? Is it pulling more towards, let's say, accountancy rather than trying to be integrative and comprehensive?
Well, I think it's really work in progress, and there's all these parallel discussions going on IPBES because everything is going so fast, right? But we have actually been having all this discussion about social, ecological, inclusiveness, power relations within the values guide for IPBES. So we are now hoping to be able to work more with the global and regional assessments to provide more this social ecological perspective. But I also see, on the other hand, that given the time frame, you really need to be very practical and go to where the data is. So it's really a big challenge, and given the time frame, I think we need to play with both, and so it's work in progress, no?
Okay. If there are no further questions, I'm sure there'll be opportunities during the next few days to interact with Patty. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfred.
A couple of logistic announcements. Today there is this guided tour to downtown Leipzig that requires registration. So if you are still interested, please register. The seats are running out. And the bus will leave from here at 7 o'clock. It will be probably a few minutes later, but let's say 7 o'clock in the entrance of the building to take the bus, and it's a one-way trip. Then you are released in downtown, and you'll have to find your way home from there. The other thing is that we are again a bit late, so the sessions will start at 10 to 10, so in 7 minutes. So they'll start 5 minutes late, okay? And I ask the session chairs to try to keep on time, better than I did with this session. Thank you.